Right, hello, this is a lesson about diffusion. Okay, if you are using your class notebook, you should be able to just fill in the do now activity. If you're doing it on paper, can you please make sure that you note down your keywords, concentration gradient, cell membrane, low and high, and that you make sure you note down your title, which is diffusion, and whatever the date is for you. Okay, we're going to have a look at something called diffusion, and the learning objective for today, explain how particles move across the cell membrane according to diffusion. So there's a couple of questions I want you to have a go at. I want you to pause the screen now, have a go at these questions, write them down, and then I'll come back with the answers. Okay, so what does Mrs. Gren stand for? Mrs. Gren is how we work out whether something is is living or not. So it stands for movement. Respiration, sensitivity, growth, excretion, reproduction, and nutrition. Okay, and that's how we tell if something is living. What organelles are just in a plant cell? So we've got our cell wall, we've got our vacuole, we've got our chloroplasts. A cell which has the ability, which has a different function. So it's adapted, a cell that's adapted to carry out a particular function. Okay, how do we work out total magnification? We do eyepiece times the objective lens. So eyepiece is normally always 10, and then you can change your objective lens. Why do we stay in a slide? To see organelles. Okay, because certain organelles won't show up unless you use a stain. So like I said, we're going to look at diffusion today, explaining how particles move across the cell membrane. Okay, so what is diffusion? Okay, diffusion is when the particles in fluids, such as liquids and gases, so this doesn't happen in solids, only in liquids and gases, are not in fixed positions. That's why it can't be a solid, because they're in a fixed position. So they're freely to move around and over each other. Okay. Diffusion is the name we give to the movements of the particles that move down a concentration gradient. The particles move randomly until they're evenly spread. Okay, so you start with quite a high concentration. I'm not going to do loads. Okay, they're all quite concentrated together. They're all quite close. They don't like to be close. So what they do is they spread out. So some will end up down here, some will end up here, some will end up here. So they're all in an even spread, and you can see that happening in this diagram here. Okay, so we're just going to watch a little demonstration of it happening. So what we do is we use something called potassium permanganate. It's a purple colour, and what we're going to watch here is what happens. So it starts off quite concentrated in the middle, and then let's have a look. So it starts off, and you can see here it's really concentrated in the middle, but over time you can see it spreading out. So we're getting more particles spreading out towards the edge. So it's still quite concentrated in the middle, but over time you can see it's moving and spreading. So the particles are spreading out, they're less concentrated, and they're no longer close together. Okay, if we were to leave this for a much longer time, you'd see it all spread out, and that colour would no longer be dark in the middle, because it would eventually spread out everywhere, so the particles are evenly spread. Okay, so what I want you to do is note down the key definition for diffusion. Okay, I put the keywords down there. I want you to write it out, leave spaces if you're still not sure, and unpause the video in a minute, and I'll give you the answers. Okay, so cells use diffusion as a way of getting important particles in and out of them. Diffusion is particularly useful because it doesn't use any energy To get into a cell, particles have to pass through and I won't be able to fit that word in, but selectively permeable membrane needs to go there. Okay, this is only good for small molecules such as oxygen and carbon dioxide. Another point that I'd like you to note down, okay, is these particles move from a high concentration to a low concentration. Okay, so they're moving from high to low. Okay, that's something else you need to write down. So why is diffusion useful? It's got a couple of quite useful functions within the human or animal cell. Cells can use diffusion in different ways of getting important particles in and out of them. It's particularly useful because it doesn't use any energy and we use a selectively permeable membrane. So it happens quite a lot in our lungs, in our alveoli. In our lungs, you should all know that we breathe out CO2 and we breathe in O2. So in our lungs, we need to make sure that we've got a system whereby we can exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. So the CO2 goes out and up to our mouths to breathe out, and the oxygen goes in to get to our cells so we can respire to make energy. Okay, and this happens by diffusion. Here, you'll have loads of CO2 waiting in your blood to go up to get breathed out, and you have loads of oxygen waiting in your lungs to get in to your blood. So that's how diffusion works. Just pass over the membrane, moving from a high concentration to a low concentration. Okay, so each of these drawings can explain diffusion and give you a caption for each stage. Okay, so in yours, you need to put this down as notes or fill it in. Okay, so this is the start here. We've got yellow particles by here and red particles by here. Okay, the particles will separate when they are first put in together, so they will naturally separate into their colours, okay, especially in a certain area like this. Okay, they will slowly start to mix due to random motion. So over time, liquids and gases have the ability to move, so they'll start to mix due to random motion. The particles are now nearly all diffused, and then here when they're completely spread out, okay, remember they're evenly spread out, spaced out. This is when we say that diffusion is finished. Okay, so there are a couple of things that affect diffusion. One of them is the distance the particles have to travel. So the larger the distance, diffusion will be slower. So this one here would happen a lot quicker because it's got less of a membrane to pass through. Okay, so the larger the distance they've got to travel, the slower diffusion will happen. It also depends on the concentration gradient. So if there's more particles, which means they're more concentrated, that means that they will spread slower. Okay, so the more particles there are, the more concentrated it is, the slower it will happen. You can obviously reverse that and say less particles, less concentrated, it'll happen quicker. And then the other thing is the surface area, okay? So if the surface area is quite large or it's quite unusual, like a weird shape, then it will happen slower, okay? The particles are going to take longer to get over that than a nice, easy straight line like that one, okay? Also, if we had a much larger surface area, again, it would happen slower. So what I want you to do, okay, is there's numbers 1 to 4 in your notebook, or you can just number them 1 to 4. Okay, I'm going to read them out and I want you to have a go at answering them, and then I'll bring the answers up at the end. Okay, so diffusion happens because particles in solution move constantly. They can move in any direction, but far more particles tend to move from a low concentration to a high concentration than the other way round. What I want you to do is think, is that true or false? So this is number 1. Is that true or false? Just note it down and then think about it as a little challenge. How would you correct it so that it is true if it was false? Only if it was false. So number 2 then, the rate of diffusion can vary. Number 2, the rate of diffusion can vary. Number 3, Diffusion is example of a passive transport. It does not require energy. And then number 4. The shorter the distance the particles have to move, the lower the rate of diffusion. And then I'm going to now show the answers for them. So if you didn't hear one, go back and listen before I show the answers. Okay, pause it if you need to. You need to read it a couple of times. So number 1, diffusion happens because the particles in the solution constantly move in the direction. Far more particles tend to move from a low concentration to a high concentration than the other way around. So that is false, because we learned that they move from a high concentration to a low concentration. Okay, so number 1 you should have got false, and there's the reason why. Number 2, diffusion can vary the rate. Yep, that is true. Okay, so the rate of diffusion, it depends on a couple of things: concentration, surface area, and distance. So it depends on 3 things. Number 3 then, diffusion is example of passive transport. It does not require energy. Again, that is true. Okay, it doesn't require any energy. The particles will just naturally move. And then finally, this one was false. The shorter the distance the particles have to move, the higher the rate of diffusion. So that if they have if they have quicker area to move from, they're going to move quicker and the rate will be quicker. Okay, so if you check out your notebook, there should be a couple of challenges to complete at the end. Make sure you fill it in and make sure you submit it. Okay, if you haven't understood something, go back and watch it again. Okay, thank you.